When I found my mother sitting at my kitchen table for the third time this month, eating my leftover takeout like she owned the place, I knew something had to change. She had somehow gotten another spare key made, despite me changing the locks twice. But what she said next made my blood run cold. "Seraphina, honey, we need to talk about your inheritance." The way she smiled while saying it told me everything I needed to know about why she had really been breaking into my house. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this wild family drama, I'm curious. Where are you watching from today? If stories about family betrayal and sweet revenge get your heart racing, like mine does, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this tale of manipulation and justice is going to blow your mind. Trust me, you will not see this ending coming, and you definitely don't want to miss how karma finally catches up with the people who think they can walk all over us. My name is Seraphina, and I thought I had the perfect relationship with my parents until 3 months ago when everything started falling apart. I am 28 years old, work as a graphic designer for a tech company in Portland, Oregon, and had always been the responsible daughter who never caused drama. My parents, Robert and Linda, had always treated me well, or so I believed. The breaking and entering started small. I would come home from work to find little things moved around. My coffee mug in a different spot, mail opened and resealed, my laptop moved slightly on my desk. At first I thought I was going crazy, or maybe my upstairs neighbor had accidentally gotten into my apartment. But then I installed a security camera after my anxiety got the best of me. The footage was shocking. My mother had been letting herself into my apartment regularly for weeks, going through my personal belongings, reading my mail, and even photographing documents on my desk. She was particularly interested in anything related to my finances, my job contracts, and most disturbing of all, any legal documents I had. I watched in horror as she rifled through my bedroom drawers, my closet, even my bathroom medicine cabinet. When I confronted her about it, she acted like it was completely normal. "Sweetheart, I am your mother. I have every right to make sure you are okay and safe," she said with that condescending tone that made my skin crawl. "Besides, you gave me a key for emergencies." The problem was I had never given her a key. She had somehow made copies without my knowledge. That is when I decided to change the locks. But within a week, she was back inside my apartment again. This time, she had eaten half of my groceries and left a note saying she was just checking on things, and that I should not be so paranoid about family. The audacity was breathtaking. I changed the locks again this time, with a more sophisticated system and additional security measures. I also started documenting everything, taking photos, saving the security footage, and keeping a detailed log of every time she broke in. What I discovered through this documentation process was far worse than simple boundary violations. My mother was not just snooping around randomly. She was specifically targeting financial documents, insurance papers, and anything related to my grandmother's estate. My grandmother Eleanor had passed away 6 months earlier and left me a substantial inheritance in her will. The inheritance included her house, her savings account, and several valuable antiques that had been in our family for generations. Here is where things got really twisted. Through my documentation and some digging into public records, I discovered that my parents had been telling extended family members that the inheritance was supposed to be split equally among all the grandchildren, not just given to me. They had been painting me as the greedy granddaughter who had somehow manipulated my grandmother into changing her will. The truth was that my grandmother had specifically chosen to leave everything to me because I was the only grandchild who had maintained a close relationship with her during her final years. While my cousins were too busy with their own lives to visit, I had spent every weekend with her, helping her with grocery shopping, doctor appointments, and just keeping her company. She had made her decision based on love and genuine connection, not manipulation. But my parents were not just spreading lies about my character. I discovered through some financial documents that my mother had accidentally left behind during one of her break-ins that they had been trying to contest the will. They had hired a lawyer and were attempting to prove that my grandmother was not mentally competent when she made her final will. They needed evidence to support their case, which explained why they were so desperate to get into my apartment and gather ammunition against me. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of text messages between my parents and my cousins that I found screenshots of in my mother's purse, which she had forgotten during her last break-in. These messages revealed a coordinated campaign to discredit me and challenge the will. They were planning to claim that I had isolated my grandmother from the rest of the family and had used undue influence to manipulate her into leaving everything to me. Reading those messages felt like a punch to the gut. These were people I had trusted and loved my entire life, and they were actively working to destroy my reputation and steal what my grandmother had lovingly left to me. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever imagined possible. But the final straw came when I realized that my mother had been photographing my personal documents to send to their lawyer. She was building a case against me using information stolen from my own home. The violation of privacy was bad enough, but the realization that they were using my own private papers to attack me legally was absolutely devastating. I knew I had to take action, but I also knew that I needed to be smart about it. Simply confronting them again would not work. They had already shown that they had no respect for boundaries or basic human decency. I needed a plan that would protect my inheritance, expose their true nature, and teach them that actions have consequences. That night, I sat in my violated apartment, surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal, and started planning my revenge. They thought they could manipulate and intimidate me into giving up what was rightfully mine. They thought they could violate my privacy and use my own belongings against me. They were about to learn just how wrong they were about their sweet, naive daughter. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the entire day researching my legal options. What I discovered was that my parents had made several critical mistakes in their attempt to steal my inheritance. First, breaking and entering is a serious crime even when committed by family members. Second, photographing and stealing personal documents for use in litigation constitutes evidence tampering and fraud. Third, their lawyer was operating on false information provided by my parents, which could get them both in serious trouble with the State Bar Association. I decided that my first move would be to gather irrefutable evidence of their crimes. I upgraded my security system to include multiple hidden cameras throughout my apartment, each one equipped with high-definition recording capabilities and cloud storage backup. I also installed motion sensors and door alarms that would alert me immediately if anyone tried to break in again. But most importantly, I set up a trap. I created fake documents designed to look like sensitive financial information and left them strategically placed around my apartment. These documents contained false information about additional assets that my grandmother had supposedly left me, including a secret bank account containing $50,000 and a safe deposit box full of jewelry. The documents were completely fabricated, but they looked authentic enough to fool someone who was stealing a quick glance. I also planted fake legal papers, suggesting that I was planning to sell my grandmother's house immediately after the inheritance was finalized. This was designed to create urgency and panic, making my parents more likely to take desperate action that would further incriminate them. The trap worked perfectly. Within 48 hours, my mother was back in my apartment, and this time she brought my father with her. The security footage captured everything in crystal clear detail. They spent over an hour going through every document in my apartment, photographing the fake papers, and even discussing their plans to use the information against me. But the most damning evidence came when they found the fake documents about the secret bank account. I watched through the live security feed as my parents became visibly excited, discussing how they could use this information to prove that I had been hiding assets and manipulating the inheritance process. They even talked about reporting me to the IRS for tax evasion based on these completely fictional assets. The next day, I received an angry phone call from my father demanding that I meet them for dinner to discuss the family situation. His tone was aggressive and threatening, completely different from the loving father I thought I knew. During that phone call, he actually threatened to take legal action if I did not start being reasonable about the inheritance. That evening, I showed up to the dinner meeting with a surprise guest, my lawyer James Morrison, who specialized in estate law and family disputes. I had also invited my Aunt Sarah, my grandmother's youngest daughter, who had always been the most reasonable member of our extended family. The look of shock and panic on my parents' faces when they saw my lawyer was absolutely priceless. They immediately started backtracking and acting confused about why I would need legal representation for a simple family discussion. But I was done playing games. I placed a tablet on the restaurant table and started playing the security footage of their latest break-in. The entire restaurant went quiet as my parents watched themselves committing felony burglary in high definition. My mother actually gasped and tried to grab the tablet, but my lawyer intervened and calmly explained that the evidence was already secured and backed up in multiple locations. My Aunt Sarah was horrified as she watched the footage. She had always known that my parents could be manipulative, but seeing them actually breaking into their own daughter's home and stealing personal documents was beyond anything she had imagined. The betrayal was written all over her face as she realized the extent of their deception. But the real bombshell came when my lawyer presented the fake documents that my parents had photographed during their burglary. He explained how they had attempted to use fabricated evidence in their legal case to contest my grandmother's will. The fact that they had tried to build their case on stolen and falsified documents meant that their entire legal challenge was not only invalid, but potentially criminal. My father tried to deny everything at first, claiming that they had only been concerned about my well-being and that they had never intended to break any laws. But when my lawyer started reading direct quotes from their text messages, discussing their plans to gather evidence from my apartment, his denials fell apart completely. The conversation became heated when my mother started crying and playing the victim, claiming that I was being vindictive and cruel to my own family. She actually had the audacity to suggest that I was the one destroying our family by refusing to share my grandmother's gift. The manipulation was so transparent that even she seemed to realize how ridiculous she sounded. My Aunt Sarah finally spoke up and delivered what turned out to be the most devastating blow of the evening. She revealed that she had been present when my grandmother made her final will and that Eleanor had specifically expressed her wishes about why she was leaving everything to me. My grandmother had told Sarah that she was disappointed in how the rest of the family had treated her during her final years and that I was the only grandchild who had shown her genuine love and care. Sarah also revealed that my grandmother had been aware of my parents' financial struggles and had actually offered to help them multiple times, but they had been too proud to accept assistance. Instead of accepting help when it was offered freely, they had decided to wait until after her death to try to steal what she had given to me. The dinner ended with my parents storming out of the restaurant, but not before my lawyer served them with a cease and desist order prohibiting them from entering my property or contacting me directly. He also informed them that we would be pressing charges for burglary, evidence tampering, and fraud if they did not immediately withdraw their legal challenge to the will. As I watched them leave, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The people I had called my parents for 28 years had revealed themselves to be nothing more than greedy criminals willing to destroy their own daughter for money. But I also felt empowered for the first time in months, knowing that I finally had the evidence and legal support needed to fight back against their manipulation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity and family drama that spread through our extended family like wildfire. My parents, instead of backing down after being confronted with evidence of their crimes, decided to double down on their attacks against me. They began reaching out to every family member, friend, and acquaintance they could think of, spinning elaborate stories about how I had become a greedy, manipulative person who was dishonoring my grandmother's memory. My phone started ringing constantly with calls from confused relatives who had been fed completely fabricated stories about the inheritance situation. My cousin Marcus called me in tears, saying that my mother had told him that I was planning to sell grandmother's house to developers who would tear it down and build condominiums. My Aunt Jennifer was convinced that I had somehow forged the will because my mother had shown her evidence that grandmother had promised to leave her antique jewelry collection to Jennifer's daughter. Each phone call was more heartbreaking than the last, because I could hear how genuinely confused and hurt these family members were. They had been fed such convincing lies that many of them were questioning everything they thought they knew about me and about my relationship with grandmother Eleanor. Some of them even started treating me with suspicion and coldness during family gatherings, clearly believing that I had somehow manipulated a sweet old lady for personal gain. But my parents had made a critical error in their campaign of lies. They had underestimated the intelligence and integrity of several key family members who decided to investigate the situation for themselves rather than simply accepting the stories they were being told. The first ally to emerge was my Uncle David, grandmother's eldest son, and my father's older brother. David had always been the family's voice of reason, and when he started receiving frantic phone calls from my parents about the inheritance dispute, he decided to do his own research. David contacted the estate lawyer who had helped grandmother write her will and discovered that everything had been handled properly and legally. More importantly, he learned that grandmother had specifically requested that the will not be shared with other family members until after her death, because she was worried about exactly the kind of drama that was now unfolding. David was furious when he realized how my parents had been manipulating the family. He called me and apologized profusely for not reaching out sooner, explaining that he had been trying to stay neutral in what he thought was a legitimate family dispute. Once he understood the truth, however, he became one of my strongest advocates, reaching out to other family members to set the record straight. The second major ally was my grandmother's longtime neighbor and close friend, Mrs. Patricia Williams, an 82-year-old retired school principal who had witnessed many of my visits with grandmother during her final years. When Mrs. Williams heard through the neighborhood gossip network about the family fighting over Eleanor's will, she was appalled. She contacted me directly and offered to provide testimony about my relationship with my grandmother and about how frequently I had visited compared to other family members. Mrs. Williams turned out to be an incredibly valuable witness because she had kept detailed journals throughout her retirement, including notes about her daily conversations with my grandmother. These journals documented my grandmother's growing frustration with family members who only called when they needed money or favors, as well as her genuine appreciation for my consistent presence and support during her declining health. But the most surprising ally came from within my parents' own circle of friends. Martha Rodriguez, my mother's best friend since high school, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the stories my mother was telling about the inheritance situation. Martha had known my grandmother well and had observed my close relationship with her over the years. When my mother started asking Martha to back up her lies by claiming that grandmother had expressed regrets about her will, Martha refused and decided to reach out to me instead. Martha revealed that my mother had been planning the inheritance challenge for months before grandmother Eleanor even passed away. She had been making comments about how unfair it was that grandmother seemed to favor me and had been researching legal options for contesting wills long before grandmother's health took a serious downturn. This information was crucial because it proved that my parents' actions were premeditated rather than emotional reactions to grief and shock. As my network of allies grew stronger, my parents became increasingly desperate and reckless in their attempts to discredit me. They hired a private investigator to follow me and document my daily activities, hoping to find evidence of wasteful spending or irresponsible behavior that they could use to support their claim that I was unfit to inherit grandmother's estate. The private investigator's reports, which I later obtained through legal discovery, were actually helpful to my case because they documented my normal, responsible lifestyle and my continued visits to grandmother's gravesite. My parents also made the mistake of trying to bribe the estate lawyer with offers of money and threats of bad reviews if he did not cooperate with their legal challenge. The lawyer, Mr. Thomas Harrison, was so offended by their approach that he contacted my attorney and offered to provide detailed testimony about my grandmother's state of mind when she made her will and about my parents' inappropriate attempts at intimidation. During this period, I also received unexpected support from my workplace and professional network. When word spread through my company about the family legal battle I was facing, several colleagues stepped forward to offer character references and emotional support. My supervisor, Rebecca Thompson, even offered to provide testimony about my professional integrity and work ethic if needed for the legal proceedings. The most touching support came from my grandmother's church community. Eleanor had been an active member of St. Mark's Episcopal Church for over 30 years, and when the congregation learned about the family dispute over her will, they were unanimous in their support for honoring her wishes. The church pastor, Reverend Michael Stevens, reached out to offer both emotional support and practical assistance, including access to church records that documented my regular attendance at services with my grandmother and my volunteer work with their elderly outreach program. As my support network solidified, I realized that I had unconsciously built the kind of chosen family that my grandmother had always encouraged me to cultivate. These were people who knew my character and integrity firsthand, rather than people who were willing to believe lies and gossip without investigation. The contrast between their loyalty and my blood family's betrayal was stark and incredibly meaningful. My attorney, James Morrison, was amazed by the strength of support I had gathered and advised me that we now had more than enough evidence and witnesses to not only defend against my parents' legal challenge, but to pursue criminal charges for their break-ins and evidence tampering. However, he also warned me that my parents were likely to escalate their attacks even further as they realized that their original plan was falling apart. He was right to be concerned. Just as I was beginning to feel confident about the legal situation, I received news that would test every alliance I had built and force me to question whether I could trust anyone in my life completely. One of my most trusted allies was about to reveal themselves as a traitor, and the betrayal would be more devastating than anything my parents had done because it would come from someone I had learned to depend on completely. The stage was set for the most challenging phase of this battle, where the line between friend and enemy would become blurred, and I would have to rely on my own strength and judgment more than ever before. Everything I thought I knew about loyalty and trust was about to be turned upside down in the most painful way possible. The betrayal came from the person I least expected and trusted most during this entire ordeal, my Uncle David. Just when I thought I had found my strongest advocate within the family, he revealed himself to be playing a much more sophisticated and devastating game than my parents ever could have imagined. It started with small inconsistencies that I initially dismissed as simple miscommunications. David would ask detailed questions about my legal strategy during our phone calls, claiming he wanted to help coordinate family support for my position. He requested copies of documents and evidence, saying he needed them to convince other relatives who were still on the fence about supporting me. At the time, his interest seemed genuine and helpful, so I shared everything with him through my attorney's guidance. But then strange things started happening. Information that only David knew began appearing in my parents' legal filings. Details about my security system and evidence collection methods that I had only discussed with him somehow made their way into their attorney's arguments. Their legal strategy began shifting in ways that seemed to anticipate and counter every move my attorney and I were planning to make. The first major red flag came when my attorney received a motion from my parents' lawyer requesting access to my grandmother's medical records from her final year of life. This motion included specific details about doctor visits and medical concerns that were not public knowledge. Only 3 people had access to this information: myself, my attorney, and David, who had helped coordinate some of grandmother's medical care during her final months. My attorney was immediately suspicious because the motion was far too detailed and strategic to have come from my parents' limited knowledge. Someone with inside access to my legal strategy and grandmother's personal information was clearly feeding intelligence to the opposing side. When confronted about the suspicious timing and specificity of these legal moves, David became defensive and accusatory, claiming that I was being paranoid and destroying the family with my suspicions. But the final proof of his betrayal came in the most brutal way possible. During a family gathering that David had specifically requested to bring everyone together and heal the family wounds, He stood up in front of 23 relatives and delivered a speech that demolished everything I had been fighting for. He announced that after careful consideration and investigation, he had concluded that my parents were right about the inheritance dispute. David claimed that he had discovered evidence that I had been manipulating my grandmother during her final years, isolating her from other family members, and filling her head with lies about how the rest of the family did not care about her. He said that he had found proof that I had been pressuring her to change her will, and that the final version of the document did not reflect her true wishes, but rather my selfish manipulation of a vulnerable elderly woman. The speech was devastating, not just because of the false accusations, but because of how carefully crafted it was to sound reasonable and concerned rather than vindictive. David presented himself as the reluctant family truth-teller who had tried to support me but could no longer ignore the evidence of my wrongdoing. He even cried while delivering parts of his speech, claiming that exposing me was breaking his heart, but that he owed it to his mother's memory to ensure that justice was done. The room erupted into chaos as family members who had been supporting me began questioning everything they thought they knew about the situation. The evidence and testimony that had seemed so convincing when presented in my favor suddenly looked suspicious when viewed through the lens of David's accusations. Several relatives who had been my strongest advocates began backing away and expressing doubts about their previous support. But David was not finished. He announced that he had contacted the State Attorney General's office to request an investigation into elder abuse and will manipulation. He claimed that he had provided them with evidence showing a pattern of psychological manipulation and undue influence that constituted criminal elder abuse. The investigation would freeze the inheritance distribution until the allegations could be thoroughly examined. The betrayal was so complete and devastating that I literally could not speak for several minutes after his speech ended. This was not just an attack on my character or my legal position, it was a masterfully orchestrated destruction of my reputation and my relationships with every person I cared about. David had used my trust and openness against me in the most sophisticated and cruel way possible. As family members began leaving the gathering, many of them refused to make eye contact with me or respond to my attempts to defend myself. The few who did speak to me expressed disappointment and confusion, saying that they did not know what to believe anymore, but that David's accusations were too serious to ignore. My Aunt Sarah, who had been one of my strongest supporters, actually told me that she needed to take some time to process this information before she could continue supporting my position. The legal implications of David's betrayal were immediately apparent. By filing complaints with the Attorney General's office and providing them with inside information about my legal strategy and evidence, he had effectively sabotaged my entire case. The investigation he had triggered would give my parents' attorney access to confidential information and would delay the inheritance distribution indefinitely while the allegations were examined. But the emotional damage was far worse than the legal complications. David had not just betrayed my trust, he had weaponized my vulnerability and used my own openness and honesty against me. Every piece of information I had shared with him in good faith had been turned into ammunition for destroying my reputation and my relationships with the people I loved most. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by security cameras and legal documents, feeling more isolated and betrayed than I had ever felt in my life. My parents had shown themselves to be greedy and manipulative, but their motivations were at least transparent and understandable. David's betrayal was far more sophisticated and cruel because it had been planned and executed with such precision and calculation. I realized that David had probably been working with my parents from the very beginning, playing the role of the supportive uncle while actually gathering intelligence and planning the most effective way to destroy my case. His questions about my legal strategy, his requests for documents and evidence, his coordination of family support. Everything had been designed to give him the information he needed to completely undermine my position at the most crucial moment. The worst part was that I could not even prove his betrayal to the family members who were now questioning my character. David had been too careful and strategic in his approach, always maintaining plausible deniability for his actions. To everyone else, he looked like a concerned uncle who had reluctantly concluded that his niece was not the person he thought she was. As I sat in the darkness of my violated apartment, I knew that I was facing the biggest challenge of my life. My support network had been shattered, my legal position had been compromised, and my reputation within the family had been destroyed by someone I had trusted completely. The road ahead looked impossible, but I was about to discover that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can lead to the most powerful alliances and the sweetest victories. In the darkest moment of my legal battle, when it seemed like David's betrayal had destroyed any chance of justice, salvation came from the most unexpected source. 3 days after the devastating family gathering, I received a phone call that would completely change the trajectory of my case and expose the true scope of the conspiracy against me. The caller was Elena Rodriguez, a forensic accountant who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. She had been contacted by Mrs. Patricia Williams, my grandmother's neighbor, who had become suspicious about David's sudden change of position and his detailed knowledge of private family financial matters. Elena explained that she had been investigating similar cases of family inheritance fraud and that several elements of my situation had raised red flags that suggested a much larger and more sophisticated conspiracy than I had realized. Elena's investigation revealed shocking information that completely reframed everything that had happened over the past several months. David had not been working alone with my parents. He had been the mastermind behind the entire inheritance theft scheme from the very beginning. His role as the concerned family member trying to mediate the dispute had been a carefully crafted cover for his true position as the primary organizer of the conspiracy. The financial records that Elena uncovered showed that David had been systematically stealing from my grandmother for over 2 years before her death. He had been using his position as her trusted son to gain access to her bank accounts, and had been making unauthorized withdrawals and transfers that totaled over $80,000. He had also been forging my grandmother's signature on financial documents and had been using her credit cards for personal purchases. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone calls that Elena had obtained through legal channels. These recordings, which had been made as part of an unrelated investigation into financial crimes in our area, captured conversations between David and my parents planning the inheritance challenge months before my grandmother's death. The recordings prove that they had been coordinating their efforts to discredit me and steal the inheritance long before I had any idea that I was being targeted. In one particularly chilling recording, David could be heard explaining to my parents exactly how they should approach the will contest and what evidence they would need to gather to support their claims. He instructed my mother to begin breaking into my apartment to photograph documents and told my father to start spreading rumors about my character within the family. The level of premeditation and coordination was absolutely breathtaking. Elena also discovered that David had been in contact with my parents' attorney from the very beginning of the legal challenge, providing strategic advice and inside information about my legal preparations. This explained how their legal filings had become so sophisticated and targeted. They had been getting professional guidance from someone who appeared to be on my side but was actually working against me. The evidence of David's financial crimes against my grandmother was overwhelming and indisputable. Elena had bank records, forged documents, credit card statements, and digital evidence showing a pattern of systematic theft that had been going on for years. She had also discovered that David had been preparing to challenge the will himself if my parents' efforts failed, positioning himself as the concerned family member who wanted to ensure that grandmother's true wishes were honored. But Elena brought more than just evidence. She brought a network of professional allies who specialized in exactly these kinds of cases. She introduced me to Detective Maria Santos, who handled elder abuse investigations for the state police, and to prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, who had successfully convicted dozens of people for inheritance fraud and financial elder abuse. These professionals had seen cases like mine before, and knew exactly how to build a criminal case that would not only clear my name, but ensure that everyone involved in the conspiracy faced serious legal consequences. Detective Santos was particularly interested in the break-ins that my parents had committed because the security footage I had gathered provided clear evidence of felony burglary. When combined with the evidence of their coordination with David and the proof of his financial crimes against grandmother, the detective explained that we had the foundation for a racketeering case that could result in significant prison sentences for all three conspirators. Prosecutor Walsh reviewed all of the evidence and confirmed that David's financial crimes alone were sufficient for multiple felony charges that could result in 10 to 15 years in prison. When combined with the conspiracy charges and the evidence of his coordination with my parents' burglaries and legal fraud, she estimated that he could face up to 25 years in prison if convicted on all counts. But the most satisfying aspect of Elena's investigation was the discovery of documents that proved my grandmother had been aware of David's financial crimes during her final months. She had been gathering evidence of his theft and had been planning to report him to the authorities when her health took a turn for the worse. The reason she had changed her will to leave everything to me was not just because of my care and attention, but because she knew that David could not be trusted with any inheritance and that my parents were likely involved in his schemes. Elena had found a handwritten note in my grandmother's personal papers that explicitly stated her awareness of David's theft and her intention to ensure that he could not access her remaining assets after her death. The note also expressed her disappointment in my parents for their involvement in David's schemes and her relief that at least one of her family members, me, had remained honest and trustworthy throughout her final years. This evidence completely destroyed David's credibility and exposed his accusations against me as projection and misdirection. Every crime he had accused me of committing, financial manipulation, elder abuse, undue influence, he had actually been committing himself. His detailed knowledge of these crimes had allowed him to craft convincing accusations, but it had also provided the evidence needed to expose his own guilt. Armed with this new evidence and professional support, my attorney filed criminal complaints against all three conspirators and requested an emergency hearing to address the false accusations that David had made to the Attorney General's office. The evidence was so overwhelming that the investigation into my alleged elder abuse was immediately dropped, and new investigations were opened into the crimes committed by David, my mother, and my father. The transformation in my legal position was dramatic and complete. Within a matter of days, I went from being the accused party in an elder abuse investigation to being the victim in a major criminal conspiracy case. The inheritance that had been frozen pending investigation was immediately released, and I finally gained access to my grandmother's house and belongings for the first time since her death. But more importantly, I had found allies who understood the full scope of what I had been facing and who had the professional expertise to ensure that justice would finally be served. Elena, Detective Santos, and Prosecutor Walsh became more than just professional associates. They became the foundation of a new kind of family built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for truth and justice. The criminal trials that followed were swift and decisive, delivering the kind of justice that I had only dreamed about during the darkest days of my family's betrayal. David was the first to face prosecution, and the evidence against him was so overwhelming that his attorney advised him to accept a plea deal rather than risk a trial that would certainly result in maximum sentencing. David pleaded guilty to elder financial abuse forgery conspiracy to commit fraud and racketeering. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution of over $200,000, including the money he had stolen from my grandmother, plus interest and penalties. The judge specifically noted during sentencing that David's abuse of his position as a trusted family member made his crimes particularly heinous and deserving of the harshest possible punishment. My parents' trial was even more satisfying because they refused to accept plea deals and insisted on maintaining their innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against them. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including burglary, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and attempted inheritance fraud. My mother was sentenced to 12 years in prison, while my father received 14 years, due to his leadership role in coordinating the break-ins and legal fraud. But the most rewarding aspect of the criminal proceedings was watching my extended family members realize how completely they had been manipulated and deceived. As the evidence was presented during the trials, relatives who had turned against me began reaching out to apologize and express their horror at how thoroughly they had been fooled by David's lies and manipulation. My Aunt Sarah was among the first to apologize, crying as she explained how convincing David had been and how guilty she felt for doubting my integrity. She had actually spoken with Detective Santos and learned about David's years-long pattern of financial abuse against my grandmother, which helped her understand that his accusations against me had been pure projection, designed to cover his own crimes. My cousin Marcus drove 6 hours to personally apologize and ask for my forgiveness. He brought his wife and children, wanting them to meet the family member he had wrongly suspected of being greedy and manipulative. Watching his kids play in my grandmother's garden while he helped me sort through her belongings was a healing experience that reminded me what healthy family relationships could look like. Even Martha Rodriguez, my mother's former best friend, reached out to express her regret for not speaking up sooner about my mother's suspicious behavior and planning. She had known something was wrong but had not wanted to get involved in what she thought was a private family dispute. Her testimony during the trial had been crucial in establishing the premeditated nature of the conspiracy. The house that my grandmother had left me became a gathering place for the family members who remained committed to honesty and genuine relationships. Mrs. Patricia Williams, who had been instrumental in connecting me with Elena and exposing the conspiracy, became like a surrogate grandmother, sharing stories about my real grandmother's life and helping me understand family history that my parents had never bothered to preserve or share. Elena Rodriguez became much more than a professional ally. She became one of my closest friends and a mentor who taught me about financial security and protecting myself from future manipulation. Through her network, I met other people who had survived similar family betrayals and learned that my experience, while traumatic, was sadly not uncommon. These connections helped me realize that chosen family based on shared values and mutual respect could be stronger and more reliable than blood relationships based solely on genetic coincidence. Detective Santos and Prosecutor Walsh also remained part of my support network, checking in periodically to ensure that I was healing emotionally from the trauma and connecting me with resources for victims of family financial abuse. Their continued support helped me transform from someone who had been victimized by family betrayal into someone who could help other people facing similar situations. The inheritance itself turned out to be even more valuable than I had initially realized. My grandmother had been quietly investing and saving for decades, and her estate included not just the house and obvious assets, but also investment accounts and life insurance policies that brought the total value to over $800,000. David's theft had represented only a small fraction of her total wealth, which meant that his crimes had been motivated by pure greed rather than financial desperation. I used part of the inheritance to establish a foundation in my grandmother's name that provides legal assistance to elderly people who are being financially abused by family members. Elena Rodriguez serves on the board of directors, and we have already helped dozens of seniors protect themselves from the kind of exploitation that my grandmother experienced. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. The experience taught me that loyalty and love cannot be assumed based on blood relationships, and that real family is built through consistent care, respect, and shared values. The people who stood by me during the crisis and who helped expose the truth became my true family, while the people who had raised me revealed themselves to be nothing more than opportunistic criminals willing to destroy their own daughter for money. Moving forward, my life is fuller and more authentic than it ever was when I was trying to maintain relationships with people who did not genuinely care about my well-being. The friends and chosen family members I have now are people who have proven their character through their actions, rather than people who expect loyalty simply because of shared genetics. My grandmother's house has become a symbol of resilience and justice, rather than a source of family conflict. I host regular gatherings for my chosen family, creating the kind of warm, authentic relationships that my grandmother always encouraged me to cultivate. The house feels alive again, with genuine love and laughter, instead of the tension and manipulation that characterized my relationships with my parents and David. The security cameras are gone now because I no longer need protection from the people who are supposed to love me. The locks are normal residential locks because the people in my life now respect boundaries and earn access to my space through trust rather than theft and deception. Looking back on this entire experience, I realized that my parents and David actually did me a tremendous favor by revealing their true nature before I wasted any more years trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial goals. Their greed and criminal behavior freed me to build the kind of life and relationships that my grandmother always hoped I would have. This story of family betrayal and ultimate justice really makes you think about what family truly means, doesn't it? Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members who put money before love? Or maybe you've experienced the blessing of finding your chosen family after biological family let you down. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the people we're related to by blood are the ones who hurt us most, while strangers become our greatest allies. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of justice and karma coming full circle. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to choose loyalty over blood when family becomes toxic. Thank you for listening to my journey from betrayal to justice. And remember, sometimes the worst family betrayals lead us to the most beautiful chosen families. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that blood automatically equals love.